Okay, hi. Well, thanks very much for coming back, everybody. We're going to try the technology again and hope it lasts this time. So I'm really sorry about the earlier session. Not quite sure what happened to my connection, but there's nothing more frustrating than hearing lots of really good questions and answers and not being able to join in. So hopefully we'll continue without any glitches this afternoon, and we're going to move quickly on to the next session, which is around training, the impact and recovery from COVID. So our next speakers don't really need very much introduction, I'm sure, but really grateful for Dr. Neil Hawkes and Di Samuels to join us today. So Neil, as you know, is the training lead for WAGE, but also the clinical lead for the National Endoscopy Workforce Training Development Subgroup and chair of the JAG Quality Assurance for Training, and a gastroenterologist in Cwm Taf Morgannwg. So thank you, Neil. And also to Di Samuels, who is Secretary of WAGE and consultant gastroenterologist and hepatologist at the Royal Glamorgan Hospital. And I understand Dr. Kathy Lee and Dr. Lavanya Shenbagaraj are also joining for this presentation. So thank you ever so much for helping out to give us the trainees' perspective, and we'll take some questions at the end. So thank you very much.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, which over the next 20 minutes is hopefully going to cover some of the challenges, but also the opportunities for our trainees and our training programs in an era post-COVID-19. I'm delighted today to say that we're joined by two trainees, Catherine, who's a surgical trainee, and Lavanya, one of my gastro trainees, along with Neil Hawkes, who's a fellow consultant at the Royal Glamorgan Hospital. So I'm now going to hand over to Neil and Catherine for the first section of this talk and discussion, where they'll hopefully outline some of the challenges facing our surgical trainees and also in endoscopy training in the months to come.
Thanks, Di. So I'm going to talk about endoscopy training and just give a brief background to where we've come from. Even before COVID, national surveys from both gastroenterology and GI trainees had highlighted problems in the endoscopy training system, with lack of access to training lists, difficulty completing full JAG certification, particularly in colonoscopy before CCST completion, and access to specific training opportunities in patients with GI bleeds, and also subspecialty training in endoscopy, so ERCP, EUS, small bowel endoscopy, and advanced polypectomy was reported as being very patchy, with some fellowships available in England, but no real opportunities or limited opportunities in Wales. For medical specialty trainees, the future impact of introducing the shape of training recommendations and reforms on endoscopy training was also being hotly debated. And in Wales, as elsewhere in the UK, during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, with endoscopy activity falling by over 95%, many trainees were redeployed to COVID duties and COVID rotas, and it's taken till the back end of this year for some trainees to get back to endoscopy training, and even then capacity on lists was limited to 60 to 70% of normal. So in a challenging environment for endoscopy training in Wales, what can we do and what is being done to support endoscopy training need? So I'm going to hand over to Kath briefly to outline what trainees can do to get the most out of their local endoscopy training at the current time.
Thanks, Neil. I think it's really important initially we take responsibility and be proactive in engaging in our training. So highlighting yourselves to the local training lead, finding out which lists are training lists, what's available, and establish yourself with a nominated trainer. Now, that can be difficult in itself. There's a lot more trainees requiring or asking for training than there is necessarily capacity to sort of train at the minute, especially with capped and reduced lists. So that makes it all the more relevant to make sure that your training need is realistic. You know, I'm a upper GI surgical trainee, I don't need to spend 6 months on my colorectal placement necessarily taking colonoscopy opportunities from someone that might value them more. And flip side is I could use those opportunities and attend an upper GI list during those 6 months, so it's not completely wasted. I think the best way to sort of go about that, firstly on a low level scale, is to communicate well within your department, know who needs what, and that overall the training lead should or would have an understanding of this. But talk amongst yourselves, you know, I may be doing an on-call on the day where my training opportunity would be, so make it aware on perhaps a WhatsApp group that I wouldn't be there, or, you know, make arrangements for someone to cover for you so that the opportunities that we do have don't get wasted. That brings me on really to the idea that kind of gave us, is to try and maximize the efficiency in endoscopy training. So one of the solutions we hope to this problem is a web-based tool where, you know, you almost sort of have a profile from a trainee perspective and a trainer perspective, and on days where you're both available and you've got a diagnostic upper list or a trainee that needs those, they would match in order to sort of, you know, best fill the opportunities that we have existing. If I perhaps was on call that day, I could make people aware of that, and it would then fall to the next most appropriate available slot. So at least we're using the opportunities that we know that we already have without creating any more at the moment. Finally, the other important aspect is incorporating. We're very lucky in Wales at the moment in YMAT to have 4 high fidelity simulators. We know that from previous research that early training is enhanced by that, and we're doing more research into sort of exactly what that entails at the moment. But incorporating that into a simulated based curriculum to go alongside Sprint that's already well established in Wales for the past 10 years, I think would be important. And we're just sort of interested at the minute into working out what fits in and how we best use that. So that's enough talking from me, really. We'll go back to Neil Hawkes to give us a bit more on what trainers can do to try and solve the problem.
Thanks, Kath. So, I mean, the first thing to acknowledge is that for all trainers across Wales, it's a really difficult time at the moment, and that any training that's being provided is having to be balanced against increased service demand and recovery planning, which is underway in all endoscopy units. But that aside, we've got to make sure that we push for provision of training lists, even within such a difficult background environment, because trainees are facing significant difficulty in access, and it's impairing. We've got data to show that it's impairing their progression through training. It's so important to protect the training list because these are our endoscopy workforce of the future, and all the projections are that the demand for endoscopy is just going to rise. So we really must protect our endoscopy trainees as they're part of our future capacity. What's the Welsh Endoscopy Training Network been doing during this time? Well, I'm proud to say that our network has delivered more courses in the past month than any other UK training centre. So Tom Yap has supported a JAG Basic Skills and Colonoscopy course at Bridgend. At the Royal Glamorgan, we've run a basic upper GI training course with PPE and all. We've run a polypectomy course. We've done an induction week for the second cohort of HEIW clinical endoscopy trainees. And last week we ran a training endoscopy trainers course, again, hoping to increase the number of trainees that are available across Wales. Over the summer, we've run online training sessions for clinical endoscopists, and we're working with WAGE to provide a timetabled programme of online learning opportunities. And these will sit alongside the existing e-learning for health courses, which are available to all trainees online, free of charge, and also the Slate training resources that we've developed in Wales as part of the Sprint programme. The National Endoscopy Programme, along with HEIW, has set up an endoscopy training management group to oversee the future provision of endoscopy training in Wales. And this will support us getting much better data about endoscopy training and the rate of progression of trainees through the different local hospitals. And also are hoping to support the development of a training faculty in Wales with increased provision of training resource for trainers. And finally, in the medium to long term, the National Endoscopy Programme is going to explore options being considered in other parts of the UK around a training academy, an endoscopy training academy, with models of immersion training periods for endoscopy, and also possibly targeted training interventions for upskilling independent endoscopists who may be struggling to meet their KPIs, and also to assist in the accreditation of bowel screening endoscopists. So I think there's a lot going on to try and support training needs across Wales in endoscopy. I'm going to hand back to Di now so that he can talk a little bit about training in hepatology.
Thanks, Neil and Kath, for a rapid but very comprehensive overview of the challenges, but also all the excellent work that's actually gone on within the endoscopy network during COVID. So, having listened to the endoscopic challenges, I'm now going to invite Lavanya to perhaps set the scene for some of the challenges that face our hepatology and gastroenterology trainees as we recover from COVID. I think it's fair to say that gastroenterology, probably like surgery, is one of those specialties that poses lots of challenges for our trainees in balancing their time within both outpatients, the demands of certainly general medical on-call rotas, but also that practical element that is present in some of the other aspects of medical training. So, Lavanya, the floor is yours to hopefully say some of the challenges and some of the opportunities you've had, and I'll hopefully come up with some of the answers to some of those problems after that.
Thank you, Di, and thank you, Dr. Neil, and thank you, Kath. That was a very useful update. So as with COVID that caused pressures to many services, training has been a challenge during the last year. And as Di said, there's been a significant issue in getting to adequate number of clinics. Compared to pre-COVID, we've struggled, especially during the second wave, to get to adequate face-to-face clinics. So we've had opportunities to attend some virtual clinics, so to try and upskill our training and keep the training ongoing. But still, compared to pre-COVID, that it has been a bit of a challenge. But we're trying to slowly and gradually improve the number of face-to-face clinics that we're getting with regards to hepatology and IBD. So I think it's better, but still a long way to go. And with regards to training in terms of general teaching, because of COVID, our weekly SBR training sessions had to be cancelled last year because it timed at the same time of the first COVID peak. So unfortunately, our weekly SBR training sessions were cancelled, but we've had quite active SBR group, and since July last year, we've managed to have an ongoing virtual initially started off as a fortnightly teaching session, and now we've increased the pace and it's pretty much ongoing every week. And that way we were able to still keep up some training and teaching ongoing amidst the COVID pandemic. During the second peak, we did have some challenges about ongoing clinical commitments because GIM was very heavy. So it was difficult, but there are centers which are now focusing on focused gastro training, like for example in UHW, in Singleton, and in Cwmtaf, where there's focused gastro training so that we can get to more clinics, more lists and more inpatient experience so that we can catch up with the lost time. I think the situation is better compared to how we were a few months ago, and fingers crossed we continue to get better with our training.
Thank you, Lavanya. I think that's summarised what I felt as a trainer, and certainly listening to my trainees, some of the challenges that they faced. So I don't think the challenges are unique to Wales, but I think we probably have some additional challenges compared to some other parts of the UK. And certainly from the viewpoint of hepatology, unlike perhaps IBD and certainly endoscopy, where despite the relatively small size of Wales, we've probably punched above our weight for the past few years. I think hepatology is still perhaps lagging slightly behind, but I think there is a chance to be optimistic here. I think certainly myself, Dr. Fidan Youssef, for example, Dr. Arish Siddiqui, we're all relatively new consultants now being appointed into hepatology roles. And I think it probably just highlights the demand and need that we have for hepatologists going forward. So I think having more of us in post will allow us to probably expand our training centres. At the present time, there are only 2 accredited training centres in Wales, that being UHW and the Gwent liver unit. And hopefully in the year or 2 to come, especially as centres go through the IQLS process, we'll see a lot more accredited hepatology centres where we'll be able to provide that more specialist experience. Reflecting on what I've been able to perhaps achieve during the pandemic and with the team, I think social media and online platforms like Teams has actually been a benefit. For the regional HCC MDT, which is actually a prerequisite requirement to be a training centre, we are now working online. And despite the snags that Teams brings, it allows up to 40 people to dial in on a Tuesday morning so that we can all contribute to those discussions. But more importantly, for people like you, Lavanya, who've got an interest in hepatology, to learn about the modalities that we use to treat HCC and then discuss with colleagues both in radiology and surgery. So I think that's been a big coup. And I think going back to what Kath highlighted it when talking about endoscopy, I think we need to be a lot smarter in sharing our opportunities. I think if we have trainees who have an interest working in a neighbouring health board, but who really need that experience in hepatology, why can't we share that training opportunity with them? And I think one of the challenges for us as a society and for Welsh Government and HIW is probably to really push on now with that single contract and single employer status, so that our trainees and as trainers, we can move in between these different centres and health boards without the rigmarole of CRB checks, etc. I think the final thing to say as well is that we are quite a small community within hepatology. And I think having got to know some of the big players in the larger centres like Birmingham over the past few years, when I was a trainee and I was consultant colleagues, we have a huge opportunity, again, because of platforms like Teams and virtual working, to hopefully share opportunities with them. And why can't we as trainees and trainers join a clinic, for instance? As long as the security aspects are there, I think GPs are way ahead of the field when it comes to this in sharing opportunities. And why couldn't Lavanya perhaps join the liver transplant MDT on a Friday to learn about the tertiary process? And I think if we can do that, then I think hopefully coming out of this, you'll still be able to meet those curriculum requirements, which are vast when we look at the whole curriculum for gastroenterology training, without having to perhaps move away from Wales. Because I think that's one of the biggest downsides at the moment, and I was one of the last to benefit from the fellowships that we offer in Wales. We don't have formal accredited hepatology fellowships in-house. So I think one of the biggest challenges for us as a community, and certainly Wage politically going forward, will be to challenge Welsh Government to invest in these services to make our own hepatology services sustainable and profitable for the years to come. So I think that's where I am with regards to hepatology, and I hope that this session has provided a very whistle-stop tour of the challenges facing all aspects of training, both for trainees and trainers for the years to come. And I hope that we'll now have an opportunity to share thoughts amongst those attending the conference and hopefully come up with some solutions and tasks for us as a Wage Exec Committee to take forward in the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That was a really interesting session, and I'm sure has provoked lots of questions and comments. We are unfortunately still having some technical issues, so if you don't mind, we're going to have to break for about 30 seconds just to test microphones, and then we'll come back to the discussion session. So if you could all just think about your questions for our last set of speakers, we'll be back with you very shortly. Thank you.
We're having some fun behind here, I must say. Right, we're on. So Paul Haley's having great problems with her kit in in mid Wales connecting in. So Neil, Kath, and myself are left to take the discussion in this section. If anybody has any questions, please put them onto the question bar with a question mark in it rather than the chat bit. But you can also apparently raise your hand, and we should be able to hear you asking your questions for real. So there's a few points that have come in here, Neil and Kath. I'll just open those myself. So the first one has come from Joe, who has suggested that training lists should have reduced points. Indeed, they should. But there's some challenges in terms of what would happen in terms of other trainees if you're on call, etc. And it's all about planning ahead, which does sound sensible. I think actually, Kath, you touched on that, didn't you, in terms of when you were talking? So do you want to just take that one from Joe?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, that was the whole concept and reason why we thought about this web-based tool that would involve both trainees, trainers, and the endoscopy development and then the endoscopy unit themselves. So there would be an element of planning ahead. These would be matched sort of 6 weeks or planned in advance so that they could be appropriately matched to the type of training profile necessary. You know, sort of a novice or a more advanced trainee would therefore have different allotted points.
Yeah, I think Kath's lost connection.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There we are. Yeah. So
can you hear Kath, John?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I can, Neil. Yeah.
Okay. So essentially, you know, you'd have the trainers and trainees matched based on their sort of training potential and training need. So the idea came from actually this problem being exactly that. You know, you don't want to lose the opportunities that we have, but we need to best use them with the most appropriate trainee available, and not backfill a list of upper GI scopes that's been reduced to 6 points for a colonoscopy trainee that, you know, needs different needs. So that's what's in development at the moment as an attempt to try and solve part of the problem that we've got with the existing structure that we have at the moment.
Great, thank you. And I think, Neil, we would certainly commend the trainee taking responsibility to determine their own training. I think that's one of the critical steps, isn't it, in terms of optimizing opportunities. Neil?
Yeah, I think it's a real partnership. It's difficult.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me, John? Yeah, I think it's a real partnership between the trainer and the trainee. And it's hard for trainers as well, because we have to remember that their numbers of endoscopies that they're doing
Oops, I think we've lost Neil. Sorry, we're having a lot of fun here, aren't we, with a VC connection? Quite uncharacteristically for me, in an NHS computer on Windows 7, it hasn't gone down yet, this whole system. But it sounds like other people are having issues there. Lawrence has put an important. And actually, Lawrence, whether you could actually come and chip in actually about the single employer model. Adam, would that be possible if we could unmute Lawrence just to see if he could contribute? Because I think that's an important point, actually.
Lawrence, if you can raise your hand, in the bar at the bottom of your screen
as well.
Yeah, Lawrence, are you able to do that? Just raise your hand, top right-hand corner, just so that we can bring you in, because I think it would be useful for us to hear a little bit about the single employer model that you've mentioned there. No, Lawrence?
Lawrence, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little hand button.
No. So Lawrence, if you can do it, it'd be great to hear about it. But basically, Lawrence has. Oh, there's a hand up there. There was.
So this is Tom.
Tom.
Yeah.
Tom, are you? Oh, Lawrence, you're in Tom's room. You're really confusing me.
Yeah.
So, Lawrence, you made a good point. I know with your role, you'll be able to explain this probably better than I would be able to in terms of the single employer model. Would you be able to just tell?
Can you hear me, John?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, you take over your company.
So the HAW has been working on this single employer model, and for the gastro trainees, they are implementing it from October, November. So a trainee can move around any hospital in Wales to undergo any type of training. So if a trainee in Swansea wants to do a ERCP list in Newport with prior facilitation with the trainers, they can come and do lists. They don't have to have a honorary contract like they used to have in the past. So that's going to be quite useful. So I think, as you will all know, the change in the shape of training, the new curriculum for gastroenterology trainees is coming on from September 2022, which means their training is reduced from the current 5 years to 4 years. And our trainees will be significantly finding it difficult to complete both their OGD and colonoscopy training. And any advanced training in, for example, in ERCP or polyp or advanced endoscopy, they will have to look for fellowships. And it's very, very important that we think now to establish fellowships, for example, in US, ERCPs or advanced endoscopy for our future trainees in the next few years who are going to come out in the next 3-4 years.
That sounds like a very welcome change. Lawrence, you might actually be able to. I know you've got a question here for Neil. Neil, are you back with us?
Yeah, can you hear me? I can hear you.
Yeah, we can. I'm really sorry about the kit here. There's a question from Lawrence, who's now just a bit off, about endoscopy academies in Wales. He wanted an update of where we were with your proposal.
Yeah, so just on Friday, we took a paper to the board of the National Endoscopy Programme, asking for permission to look at options around training academies in Wales. The most advanced model in the UK is in the southwest of England, and what they're looking to do is have they're proposing 2 hospitals, one in Cheltenham and one in Torbay, where there is a dedicated theatre just for training, and also importantly, investment in trainer time dedicated to being able to provide those training lists with experienced trainers from different places contributing to the training programme. What they're trying to look at providing is periods of sustained training in endoscopy. So just if you had 6 upper GI cases and you were doing the morning and afternoon, you could potentially get through 60 upper GI endoscopies in a week of intense training. And that can significantly increase a trainee's experience. And we know from Paul Dunkley's learning curve data that one of the things he found was that you learn faster and more effectively if you've got exposure to ongoing training opportunities. So I think the challenge back to Lawrence would be, could he liberate trainees from training programs for a week or 2 to come to an endoscopy training academy if it was there? I think the other point that we're trying to make strongly is that trying in Wales to try and take out of an existingly constrained endoscopy service 2 theatres just to do training, it wouldn't work. And we're looking at seeing if we can get funding to build 2 new theatres where we could put this activity through, so that it would be a win-win for everybody. So I think hopefully more to come on this. I don't know whether we can hear Hayley and whether she's got anything else to say as the NEP programme lead.
Hayley? Looks like we've got Lawrence coming back in. Lawrence, do you want to? No, unfortunately, we can't hear you again, Hayley. We can see your mouth moving, but we can't hear the words coming out. Gosh, this is great, but I think I might have to have a crash course of omeprazole after this meeting. My ulcer will be playing up, I think. Lawrence, you've come back in. Do you want to ask anything at all? Respond to Neil?
Perhaps you could type it in the chat.
Yes, that might be helpful. Lawrence has gone down as well. There's a question from Joe, just a quick one, which Neil and maybe Kath about insourcing. And what's the effect of that on our training opportunity, or could it be used?
I think a lot of the insourcing activity is actually happening at the weekends, and the problem is that you've got specific contracts between health boards and the providers with quite ring-fenced indications as to what they will and won't do. And at the moment, the current contracts don't really give much wriggle room for adding training. It's all about service provision and high levels of activity at the weekends. Hopefully, though, that will create more room within the training system to make sure that during the week we are providing adequate training lists. And I really hope that as well in Wales we can take a more medium to longer term view and see that actually getting trainees through the system quickly becomes part of the capacity solution in the long run, because actually for every trainee that comes out of the other end of the system before in terms of upper GI endoscopy, for example, they're then able to come out and do diagnostic lists, to backfill lists, and to provide more capacity for health boards. And I think we really have to remind people that that is the case, because too often training is seen as being a sort of block on the system rather than liberating capacity at the end of training. So I think there's a lot we need to get right. There's a lot of organisation that has to be put into place to make training lists as efficient as possible, to backfill training lists where there's a trainer present. And I think that'll probably be the solution rather than, unfortunately, the insourcing lists. Nationally, there's a really interesting statistic from the NED data that actually less than 10% of all endoscopy lists that are used for training. And so we really do have space to try and improve our offering for training, I think.
Thank you. And just one quick response, Kath. There's a question from Simona, one of our trainees, about is there a system at the moment to access training lists on other sites?
So I suppose once the lead employer is out, then the answer to that would be yes, but obviously it needs organisation, and that's where our sort of web-based tool we're trying to incorporate it will help. Initially, it'll be on a local hospital and then sort of health board basis, but if that works, then the concept of it is that you can have specific ERCP trainees that are then able to go across the board and sort of book into ERCP lists with trainers and trainees that have compatible training potential. So, I mean, from an existing time frame from the gastroenterology side of things, I'm not entirely sure about how that would be done at the moment, because obviously if you're going across sites, you're potentially taking somebody else's opportunity and it all needs to be kind of above board. But that's where the tool would be sort of provide some transparency really in who's attending where. The departments themselves will know who's planning to attend, as will the consultants or the nurse endoscopists, and it should provide a little bit more clarity as to who's going where for what reason.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have to wrap this session up because we've overrun a little bit. Thank you very much, Neil and Kath, for your contributions.